Good evening. Everybody here will be familiar with the likes of 1984 and to a lesser extent Animal Farm. Animal Farm isn't as direct a message. It's what's called an allegory. It's not the only one, and it isn't the first. There was one just over 100 years ago. Believe it or not, The Wizard of Oz. Everyone thinks it's just a fairy tale, but it isn't. There's actually a very, very special meaning to the story. It was written by a man who lived in South Dakota, which at that time was desperately poor. Even though the people there worked very hard, they didn't actually have much money. The banks had it. That's why they were poor, because the banks made sure they were. The banks and the railroads. And the story was that the American people were being destroyed by those groups, by the banks and the railways. And The Wizard of Oz was a story about how they were overcome. That's why it starts off in Dakota, the heart of the breadbasket in the United States. The place where the food came from, but the money never quite got there because the railways took it off them. And so did the people back in the east who ran the banks, and the ones in the west who spent it. And that is why, in that story, you have the Wicked Witch of the East. The Wicked Witch of the East. She represents, of all things, Wall Street and the banks. And she has to be destroyed so that the people have got a chance in life. Later on, the Wicked Witch of the West is also destroyed. She represents the so-called liberal elite who ran the United States. And she is drowned. And her drowning represents the end of the drought which destroyed farming in the United States. The banks all knew the people couldn't pay. They knew why. There was no bloody rain. But the banks didn't mind that. They held all the mortgages and they foreclosed on them, even though nobody else was there to take up those farms, because a farm without water is a desert. And that's what they had. They called it the Dust Bowl, and it lasted for years. And the banks knew this, and they still foreclosed. They'd rather have a little bit of paper tucked away saying that they owned this worthless land and leave it to the people to try and earn a living. And that was what this man was writing about. That was what the Wicked Witch of the East was. Now the main characters in The Wizard of Oz seem a little bit strange, don't they? You have the Tin Man. What the hell is that about? Well, the Tin Man represents the industrial workers thrown on the scrap heap in the 1890s and left to rot and rust. So, that's where the Tin Man comes from. The Scarecrow, he represents the farmers. He doesn't understand why he doesn't have any money, because he doesn't have a brain. So he works very hard.
Take this out.
He works very hard, and he doesn't have any money. He doesn't understand the system. The system uses him, but doesn't value him. The Munchkins, they represent the little people. And later on, when they are shown how important they are, they take over the system. They are the ordinary people, not the ones with the money, the ones with the votes, the ones who actually don't always use them, the ones who do the work, not the ones who sit on their arse counting the money that other people make and they spend. That's the Munchkins. Now why was it called The Wizard of Oz? Well, there's a reason for that. O-Z. OZ, as anyone here will know, is ounces. That's all it is, ounces. The Wizard of Oz is about the restoration of a modern currency for the United States based on silver rather than gold. The reason why that was important is that there was more silver. Simple as that. It would ease the money supply. The banks would be charging less interest, so people wouldn't be getting screwed into an early grave feeding a banker out east. That's what it was about. Oz, ounces. And that's why they set out on the yellow brick road, because that leads to Washington, the Emerald City, where they meet the wizard, the president, and they find out that he's not this all-powerful figure after all, because there's someone behind the curtain pulling levers. The Wizard of Oz actually disappears in a hot air balloon. What does that represent? Politics, politicians, hot air. That's all most of them actually are, if they actually get approached. So, all of this had a hidden meaning. And the Cowardly Lion, who was that? It represented William Jennings Bryan. Now this man stood to be president 3 separate times. He was defeated on each occasion. Not by accident. He was extremely popular, but not with the people who owned the banks and the railroads. They didn't like him, because he knew what they were doing to the ordinary working man. And he told them what he was going to do if he got into office. Which was not very bright, really, because they made sure he didn't get there. They spent millions, and they had it. Let's be honest, they owned the banks. They stopped him getting into power. So the Cowardly Lion represents William Jennings Bryan. In the story, he goes back to the jungle and becomes king of the beasts. That represents the hope that Jennings Bryan would go back into politics and become president. The whole story is about hope. Hope for the working man. Hope that they overcome the system. They didn't. They didn't do it then. They haven't done it now. The same things are going on. The same powers are still there. We are still being crapped on by people who tell us we're not working hard enough. The same forces that William Jennings Bryan campaigned against, that the Wizard of Oz ridiculed, are still there. These clowns are still destroying other people's lives to make an extra profit to go with all the other profit they already have. And they're getting away with it. Now it's called globalization. And you're told that if you stand against it, you're a fool. This is just the way business is.
Britain is bankrupt, and it has been bankrupted by a series of Conservative and Tory administrations over the past few decades, which have wasted billions on foreign aid, untold hundreds of billions on immigration and the asylum swindle, and subsidising the bankers who caused all the economic trouble in the first place. Our economic policy is very, very simple. There will be one state-run bank which will be run to the interests of the British people and no one else. I tell you now, a BNP government will overnight wipe out the national debt. And how will we do that? We'll wipe it out by simply cancelling and calling in this outrageous criminal loan to the banks to keep them going. £150 billion of your money has been put up. £150 billion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they say, what is the national debt? Who do we owe this money to? Who do we owe this money to? You know, national debt is comprised out of something which is it's money borrowed from private and foreign investors and bankers. So listen to the madness of this and go check it out if you don't believe.